I want to start with a famous question, which is asked by many of the Mefarshim, the commentaries on the Haggadah, which is when, and everyone please, if anyone can unmute themselves or press their space bar and participate, that would be great, that would be amazing. When did the Jews eat matzah for the first time, according to what we read in the Torah? So we know they ate matzah the first time on the night of that first Pesach, that first year of Pesach in Mitzrayim, before they left Mitzrayim. They ate matzah. They had a whole ritual. They stayed in their homes. They ate matzah. They ate maror. They ate the korban Pesach, the Pesach sacrifice, and the plague of the firstborn happened. The question is that during the Seder we say, Matzah zo sha'anu ochlin al shum ma. Right towards the end of the Magid section, Rabbi Gamliel says, whoever didn't say these three things has not fulfilled his obligation, who explains the meaning of the Korban Pesach that we ate in the time when the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, was standing, the matzah and the maror. And matzah zu sha'anu ochlin al shum ma, al shum shelo hispik b'tzeikam shel avotenu lahachmitz, ad shenigla aleim melech malchi amlachim u'ge'alam. And then he quotes the pasuk. Why do we eat matzah? Because we left Mitzrayim so quickly. We left Mitzrayim with such haste, chipazon, as we find the word in the Torah, that we didn't even have time for the bread to rise. If anyone's ever baked for Shabbos, baked challah or any other type of bread, you know you have to make the bread. And then I know we are very strict. In our matzah bakeries, if we leave the bread for 18 minutes, we suspect that it might have become chametz and is no longer kosher for Pesach. But we know really, we leave the bread, we have to let it rise for however long, for half an hour, till it's ready to be baked into leavened bread, into chametz. But we left Egypt so quickly that we didn't even have time for the bread to rise. We made a quick dough, and we had to run with the dough in a sack on our backs. And what is that meant to symbolize? The lightning speed of the redemption. We didn't, so one shouldn't think that the exodus from Egypt, the Yetziat Mitzrayim, was a natural process. It was just one of those things in history. After all, I come from the United States. If you remember that there was a colony of yours that rebelled a while ago, and about almost 90 years after they rebelled. So there were slaves in the colonies, and Lincoln freed the slaves, and that took many, many years. It was a long process. There was an abolition movement for a whole generation until they freed the slaves. That's how natural history works, but that's not how Yetziat Mitzrayim works. When we left Mitzrayim, that wasn't part of natural history. That was a revelation. That's called Nigel Aleim Melech Malchi Amlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the King of Kings, Hashem. Blessed be He, was revealed Himself to us. We left so quickly that it was a miracle, not part of the natural process. We didn't even have time for the dough to rise. We couldn't even wait an hour. Now, here's the question, which I want to spend however much time I have tonight trying to answer and seeing A, how we can answer this question, and B, what the answer to that question means for us on an existential level and for us on a practical level as Jews in the modern world. The question is, if you look at the timeline, they ate matzah on the Seder night. They left Egypt very quickly on the next morning. So they did not eat matzah at the Seder night, that first year in Mitzrayim, because they left so quickly they didn't have time for their dough to rise. That hadn't happened yet. And here's the question. Imagine you were a Jew who was being freed from Mitzrayim that night. Moshe came to you and told you, bring a korban Pesach, a Pesach sacrifice. You asked why? You understood why, because you have to bring a sacrifice to Hashem to show your loyalty to Hashem, to serve Hashem. Great. Eat bitter herbs, maror. Why? Because we're leaving a very bitter sojourn and enslavement in Egypt. Eat matzah. Why am I eating matzah? Why am I eating unleavened bread tonight? There's no meaning to it. tomorrow I'll figure out the meaning. But that night, that first night when the Jews ate matzah, what was the meaning behind the matzah they ate if the story of matzah hadn't happened yet? And I want to see if we can have time to give 3 answers to that question, each of which I think will be significant for us as Jews in the modern world, perhaps even before the modern world. Answer number 1 is found in the Ramban. The Ramban in his Perush, his commentary on Chumash, not in the original story of the Exodus in Sefer Shemot, but later on in Sefer Devarim, in Parshat Re'eh, where the Torah commands us for the last time to celebrate the various holidays. So the Ramban there says there are actually 2 different layers of meaning, 2 reasons why we eat matzah on Pesach. One of them is to remember the Exodus, to remember how quickly and miraculously we were freed from Mitzrayim. But that's only one reason. The other reason is to remember the poverty and bitterness of our enslavement, very much like maror. Matzah is 2 things. It is the bread of redemption because it is quick, lightning quick, like our redemption. It is also the bread of affliction. It is called lechem oni in the Torah. Lechem oni means poor man's bread or bread of affliction. Matzah reminds us not only of our redemption, but also of our slavery. As a matter of fact, the Abarbanel in his commentary to the Torah, and a number of other commentators as well, say that when our ancestors were actually slaves in Egypt, we ate matzah. Because matzah was poor bread you fed slaves. After all, it didn't take time to bake. I mean, no one baked for the slaves. They baked for themselves. They gave a very short lunch break. It only took a few minutes to bake. It was cheap, only flour and water. And perhaps you may recall from last Pesach, you may recall this with dismay even, it stays in your stomach for a while. You feel full for a while because, it sits around for quite a bit. So the slaves won't complain that they're hungry, for quite a number of hours if you give them a little piece of matzah. If so, we can suggest that these 2 meanings of matzah, and then the answer would be that first Pesach night in Mitzrayim, our ancestors, when they sat to the very first Pesach Seder in history, they ate matzah. Why did they eat matzah? They ate matzah for the same reason they ate maror. It made sense to them. Matzah reminds them of the poverty. It's very poor bread, the poverty of their enslavement. Maror reminds them of the bitterness of their enslavement. It was both poor and bitter. And then the next morning, they learned a second reason for eating matzah, which would last through the generations, which that it also reminded them of the quickness of their redemption. If in fact there are 2 different aspects, 2 different themes in the mitzvah of matzah, where do we find these in the Seder? So, interestingly, we have a principle that is taught in the Gemara near the end of Masechet Pesachim called Matchil Bignut U'Mesayem Bishvach. We begin with the bad, we end with the good, right? That's the right way to tell a story, right? Now, imagine you were telling your kid the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and he never heard it yet, which is unlikely in our days, right? But once upon a time, perhaps there's some countries where no one's heard the story of the Exodus yet. You don't start, you're telling any story. You don't start with, in the end, we lived happily ever after, because then the rest becomes boring, right? During the Seder, our Chachamim command us to teach in a way that is engaging and captivating, right? That's why we have to teach each son in a slightly different fashion, right? Differentiated instruction, as they call it nowadays, is maybe the earliest text of instructing, the earliest text commanding teachers to engage in differentiated instruction in human history. That's why we have the kids ask questions, we make it interactive, and that's why we start with the bad parts and then end with the good bits. We start with a little bit of a suspense. We start with, we're slaves in Egypt. What's going to happen? Are we going to get out or not? Okay, the kid knows in the back of his mind that we're sitting here today, but still, we always start with the bad and end with the good. That's therefore, when the kid asks Ma nishtana, we end with Avadim Hayinu, we were slaves. And then Hashem took us out. Okay, so one aspect of matzah, if there are two themes of matzah, one aspect is the bad. We were poor, downtrodden, and oppressed in Mitzrayim. The other aspect is the good, is that we're redeemed with lightning speed. At the beginning of the Seder, it would then behoove us to explain matzah, explain the negative connotation, the theme of suffering present in matzah. Towards the end of the Seder, it would behoove us to explain the redemptive theme of matzah. And that is, in fact, what we do. What are the very first words of the Maggid section? The Maggid, the telling the story section of the Haggadah. The very first words of the Maggid of the Haggadah are halach ma'anya. This is the bread of affliction, the achalo avatana bi'ared Mitzrayim, which our ancestors ate in the land of Mitzrayim. Now, there is some controversy as to exactly what that's referring to, but the simple meaning of the words tell us that our ancestors in Mitzrayim ate poor bread, ate bread of poverty, because they lived in poverty and affliction and enslavement. That's the beginning. We start with matzah representing our slavery, representing our poverty and our suffering. We end with the line I quoted earlier, Rabbi Gamliel Omer, is the very, very, very end of the Maggid section, right before we say 2 paragraphs of Hallel and then move on to the meal. We end with Matzah zusha anu ochlan al shoma al shum shlo hitzpik b'tzei kam shel avotenu lachmetz at shenigla lehem melech malchi amlachim hakadosh baruch hu galam. We end with a matzah representing the fact that God revealed himself and redeemed us from Mitzrayim before we had time for the bread to rise. So in the beginning of the Seder, matzah represents slavery, when we're still slaves, before we've told the story of the Exodus. At the end of the Seder, by the time we finish this story, now matzah no longer represents merely slavery, but represents redemption as well. And therefore we tell the story, we explain the meaning of matzah as representing redemption. An interesting point comes up then, if we go back to the beginning of the Haggadah. What are we to remember then? Matzah, Pesach is called Chag HaMatzot, right? The holiday of matzah. What does matzah remind us of? According to this interpretation of the Ramban and many others, it reminds us both of our redemption and of our affliction. Interestingly then, what are we to learn from matzah reminding us of our redemption? We're to learn the debt of gratitude that we owe to Hashem, and we're to learn perhaps how important Hashem considers us in that he redeemed us. What are we to learn from the theme of matzah as representing affliction? On the one hand, it helps us appreciate the redemption more. If we feel the poverty of affliction, we have more appreciation for the final redemption. However, I think there's another element. Halach ma'anya diachalo avatana bi'ara de Mitzrayim. This is the bread of affliction. We start out, the first thing we say, it's not the first thing we say Kadesh, and then we say the bracha of Hadbori Priyadama on the vegetable for Karpas, but it's the first thing we say in the Maggid in telling the story, besides the Kiddush and the bracha that we make before we eat every vegetable. The first real substantive statement that we say in the Haggadah. What are we saying? Halach ma'anya, this is the bread of affliction. What's the very next thing we say? Someone participate. Tell me what the very next thing we say after halach ma'anya diachalo avatana be'ared de Mitzrayim. Who remembers the next words? Exactly. Whoever is hungry, come and eat. Whoever is needy, come and celebrate the Pesach with us. Meaning we invite the poor into our homes to share our food with them. What is the connection between halach ma'anya diachalo avatana bi'ared de Mitzrayim, this is the bread of affliction, and all who are hungry come and eat, and sharing our bread, our unleavened bread, with the poor? Okay, this also, there are many different interpretations. As you know, the Haggadah might be one of the books in all of human history which has the most commentaries written on it. It might very well be. It's more commentaries than Aristotle, more commentaries than, I don't know, maybe not the Tanakh. But I think the simplest interpretation, the simple shot is, this is the bread of affliction. I remember that we who are now strong and proud and mighty were once downtrodden, poor, and oppressed. What does it do to someone if they remember that they were once poor and oppressed? Imagine an individual who was brought up rich and privileged, remained rich and privileged. Bli Ayin Hara, let him stay rich and privileged. I'm very happy for him. But he sees a beggar in the street. It's going to be hard for him to empathize. It's going to be hard for him to put himself in the shoes of that beggar in the street just because he's never experienced poverty. He's never experienced suffering. He's never been oppressed. It is very important. The Torah says many times, love the stranger, because you were once strangers in Egypt. As a matter of fact, Rav Soloveitchik once commented, a bit tongue-in-cheek perhaps, but he once commented that there are some Jews who are not religious. They've forgotten the events that transpired at Har Sinai when we received the Torah. But somehow they still remember that we were slaves, the experience of being downtrodden and oppressed in Egypt, and that we were redeemed from Egypt. They forgot Har Sinai, but they still remember Yetziat Mitzrayim. And that's why even the Jews who are not religious fight so much for social justice, because they remember we were once downtrodden and oppressed and we were redeemed. So they feel for all the downtrodden and oppressed and want to redeem them. Okay, hopefully they'll soon remember Har Sinai and keep the rest of the Torah as well. But that's a very basic, what's Rav Soloveitchik trying to point out? That a very basic part of Judaism is, even before we got the Torah, is that we were downtrodden and oppressed and we were redeemed. We were redeemed for many reasons. One of the reasons we were redeemed is because God has mercy on the downtrodden and oppressed, because those are the attributes and characteristics of Hashem. And therefore, when we remember that we were once poor, halachma anya is the root word ani, poor person. We remember we were once poor. What should our reaction be? Our reaction should be, I was once poor. I mean, probably many of us in this room now, virtual room, maybe we were never poor. I know I was never poor. Baruch Hashem, thank God, I was never poor. I never had to suffer. I never went hungry. I never wondered where my next meal would come from. But at the Seder night, when I eat the matzah, I try to remember not only the redemption, but the poverty of the affliction as well. I try to imagine that all I have to eat is matzah. I try to imagine I'm a slave and I'm downtrodden and oppressed. And what's my natural reaction? Maybe someone else out there is poor even nowadays. And now I know what it feels like. I taste the poverty a little. I know what it feels like. And then I empathize more with the poor people, even though I'm from a different economic and social class. I can imagine what it feels like just a bit, and that's enough for me to invite him into my house, for him no longer to be a stranger or the other, but to treat him as an equal, as a brother. That is, I think that's sort of the takeaway, perhaps for us from this first answer. So let's review. The question was, what did matzah mean before they left Mitzrayim, when they hadn't yet left in haste? One answer is, matzah has two meanings. The second meaning is leaving in haste. The first meaning is poverty, lechem oni. It reminds us of our poverty. That's why in the beginning of the Haggadah we say, halach ma'anya, call it bread of poverty. At the end of the Magid, we call it the bread of lightning quick redemption. And that's why right after we remember our poverty, we then empathize with those who are poor even nowadays, with the actual poor people amongst us. We feel their pain a bit and we invite them to our house and we do something about it. That is one approach. Let's go to a second approach, however. A second approach is based on a commentary quoted by a book called the Sefer Avudraham, written by Rav David Avudraham around 1300, which is mostly about the various prayers of every day, of the brachot we say all the time, of the Shabbat and the Chagim. And he quotes it from Rav Yosef Kimchi. Says Rav Yosef Kimchi, is quoted in a number of books. He says, really, when they ate the matzah that first Seder night, they ate that matzah to commemorate that they would be redeemed in a lightning fast fashion the next day. Al Shem Ha'atid. They ate it because of what would happen in the future. Now here it gets a little tricky. If they ate it, how could they eat it? How could they eat matzah to commemorate something that hadn't happened yet? Meaning what Rav Yosef Kimchi is saying is that the only meaning of matzah, there's only one meaning. It doesn't commemorate or stand for. It's not a metaphor for our affliction. It only commemorates our redemption. If it only commemorates our redemption, the Geula, they ate it the night before in advance, because it would commemorate the Geula, the redemption that would happen in another 12 hours. The question is, but what did that mean? Like, I'm a guy who was alive at that time, right? And Moshe comes and tells me, eat matzah. I say, why eat matzah? He says, you'll see later, right? Why am I eating matzah? So the Beis Halevi is lived over 100 years ago, named Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. His great-grandson, Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, was the famous Rav Soloveitchik from America, from YU, who was so influential on the world of modern Orthodoxy / religious Zionism, neither of which he liked. He just liked Torah Jews who learned Torah and served Hashem. But his great-grandfather namesake, Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, the Beis Halevi, struggles with this. Says, how could the Jews at the time when they, at that first Seder night, have done something that didn't mean anything yet, whose only meaning would be revealed later? How could you do something that doesn't mean anything yet? And he says that's exactly the point. The Jews in that era were no different than Jews nowadays. How many things are there? How many mitzvot are there in the Torah that don't mean anything to us, that we don't understand? That seem strange to us, that seem peculiar, that seem backwards, that seem old-fashioned, that seem arbitrary. There's always, this was something they didn't understand and they weren't meant to understand. Says the Beis Halevi, Rav Soloveitchik, says that was precisely the point, right? As they say, that's not a bug, that's a feature. That was precisely the point. Hashem commanded them to eat matzah without understanding why. What's the point of commanding someone to do something without understanding why? It was a test of faith. What does it mean to be a Jew? To be a Jew does not mean to only do things that we understand why. Does not mean to keep only the parts of the Torah that make sense to us. Okay, there are some denominations of Judaism nowadays who believe in only keeping the parts of the Torah that make sense to us, who believe that we don't have to keep anything that we don't understand. But we're not discussing that now. Let's stick with traditional Judaism. In traditional Judaism, there are parts of the Torah that we understand. There are parts that we don't understand. Hashem sent Moshe to command the Jews that first Seder night. He says, you want to be freed from Mitzrayim? You want to go out? You got to do three things. Eat maror to remember how bitter it was. Bring a korban Pesach. Okay, at that time, because you take the blood, you put on your doorsteps, it keeps the plague of the firstborn, the Makat Bechorot, away. Eat matzah, and I'm not telling you why. Just eat matzah. What would the Jews do at the time? They had two choices. They could say, I'm eating matzah, even though I don't know why, because I'm sure there must be a good reason. Or they could say, no, it doesn't make sense to me. I don't do things that don't make sense to me. I'm not going to do something just because someone told me to. Those are the two choices. If you look in the Haggadah, there are four sons. The Chacham, Rasha, Tam, She'enu Yodei L'Shol. One of them is the wicked. What does the wicked son say? Ma ha'avoda zot lachem. What is this service? What is this rituals? What is it worth to you? What is it to you? Meaning, what is this worth? How does it make sense? Why should I do it? Explains the Beit HaLevi. What was the Rasha's mistake? What was the mistake of the wicked son? And, it's very, very incisive. He says, the wicked son is not a bum who's out drunk on the streets. He's not a hooligan. The wicked son has a philosophy, has a way of looking at the world. Says, what is this avoda? What is this service of God to you? If you can explain to me what it's for, what it's all about, I will do it. If you can't explain it to me, then I will not do it. The Russia is not a hooligan. The Russia is an intellectual who wants to understand. We should all be intellectuals who want to understand. But the Russia, the wicked son, wants to understand before he's willing to commit himself. And that's his problem. Because in order to be a Jew, we have to commit ourselves even before we understand everything, because we're never going to understand everything. That's what faith is all about. Faith means that if something is commanded by Hashem, that if the Torah says something, then I'm willing to give the Torah the benefit of the doubt. I'm willing to believe that if I don't understand it today, I'll understand it tomorrow. If I don't understand it tomorrow, I'll understand it the next day. If I don't understand it in this generation, they'll understand it in the next generation. And if I don't understand in this world, I'll understand it in the next world. Faith means that even when things don't make sense to me, I trust that they make sense because they've been told to me by someone much smarter than myself. That being who is much smarter than myself, being Hashem, being God. That was the test. What happened to the Russia? We say to the Russia, the wicked son in the Haggadah, Ilu hayasham lo haya nigal. If he was there, he wouldn't have been redeemed. Why would he not have been redeemed? Very simple, according to this explanation. He would not have been redeemed because he wouldn't have eaten the matzah. The Russia would say, I don't understand why. Why do I have to eat this matzah? It doesn't make sense to me. I'm not doing anything if it doesn't make sense to me. And then he wouldn't have been redeemed, because those who ate the matzah through the power of that matzah, they ate the matzah, they deserve to be redeemed with lightning quickness, just like matzah is baked exceedingly quickly. Those who did not eat the matzah had no merit by which to be redeemed. According to the Beit HaLevi, I think the matzah is speaking very, very much to the modern Jew, or at least to this modern Jew. There's a lot of things I don't understand in the Torah. It is inspiring to know that perhaps my ancestors didn't understand why to eat matzah either on that first Seder night. But you know what? They're my ancestors because they ate it anyway, and they made it out of Mitzrayim. And 12 hours later, they realized how much sense it made. They realized that, of course, it was appropriate to eat matzah last night, because the matzah symbolizes what was about to happen to us. Of course, we ate matzah. That was a portent of what was in store for us. Hashem asked us to eat matzah because he knew that we would leave in a mere 12 hours before our bread had time to rise. So matzah in the Zohar, which is one of the most basic works of Kabbalah, calls matzah lachma demhemnuta, the bread of faith. Why is it called the bread of faith? Because perhaps, according to this second explanation, the act of eating matzah, originally, the primordial matzah, was an act of faith. Only the next morning was it revealed that it was in fact a very rational thing to do, to eat matzah, because it represented the story and encapsulated the story of our redemption. There's a third explanation as well, however, which is perhaps even more challenging for us as Jews in the modern world. And this third explanation, sometimes you can find very deep and meaningful explanations by looking in the classical mefarshim, the commentaries. Sometimes fascinating truths are revealed by history, by archaeology. Sometimes we discover things that were not known to everyone in the medieval world. The question is, what is the relationship between matzah and Egypt and ancient Egypt? So once upon a time, I don't know anything about prehistory, right? Apparently, once upon a time, we were all cavemen or something like that, right? We lived a very primitive lifestyle. Once upon a time, everyone only ate matzah because we had not developed the technology of baking leavened bread. Once upon a time, we just didn't know. We didn't know how to get yeast, right? Anyone? Hopes maybe some of us, we bake challah, right? What do? You put yeast in the bread, and that's what makes it rise. Now, I know we are very strict in our matzah bakeries. Even if we don't put yeast, if the dough sits for 18 minutes, we say maybe a yeast spore from the air. You know, there are these yeast spores floating around the air apparently. There's some tiny chance it could have landed in the dough and made it start rising, and we throw it out. It's not kosher Prepesach. Okay, but that's because we're very, very strict. Practically, if you want to have a bakery and bake leavened bread, you need yeast. Nowadays, we could buy our yeast in the supermarket, and it's artificial. They make it in a factory out of chemicals, etc. Okay, once upon a time, they didn't have yeast. They didn't have bread. They didn't have leavened bread to eat. Everyone ate flatbread. They also didn't have beer to drink because beer is also fermented. You also need yeast to make beer. Once upon a time, life was tough. There was no leavened bread, and there was no beer to drink. Then along came, if you look in the, I don't know, one could Google these things, or when some people here are my age, so you'll understand what I mean when I say you could look it up in the encyclopedia. Okay, those who are not quite my age, you could Google it. Who invented yeast? Who invented brewing beer and making leavened bread? The answer is ancient Egypt, over 3,000 years ago. Ancient Egypt, over 3,000 years ago, they were the heights of civilization. They didn't just have military power. They had the most advanced culinary culture in the world because they had the secret of making leavened bread. Okay, nowadays, not such a secret. We know how to make leavened bread. But they had the secret of leavened bread and beer to drink with it. They knew how to ferment their grain products. This perhaps is hinted at a few places in the Torah. Perhaps this is hinted at in the story of Yosef, when we know that his master left everything in his hands except for the bread, knew nothing except for the bread which he ate. Maybe that hints at the fact there was some secret of bread which was not handed over to a foreigner, even the most high-ranking foreigner who was in charge of the entire house. And we know later on that the Egyptians would not eat bread with the Canaanites. They wouldn't sit with Yosef's brothers. Perhaps that also hints at the fact that their bread was very different. And they had a special bread which they didn't share with others. Perhaps. But in any case, we now know historically something which they knew in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, but they didn't know in the time of the Rishonim, the medieval commentators. We know that ancient Egypt invented leavening and fermenting grain products. Egypt was tremendously powerful and was advanced. They had their army, they had their religion, and they had their culture. They had their advanced foods, which were more delicious and more luxurious than anyone else's. Now, here's a fascinating question. What does it mean then to eat matzah? What does it mean to have a celebratory meal, the most special meal ever, and eat matzah? So, the Midrash tells us that one of the layers of meaning within the Korban Pesach, right? They slaughtered a paschal lamb for the Korban Pesach, was a rejection of the Egyptian religion, because the Egyptians worshiped the sheep. And when we slaughtered the sheep, we were thumbing our noses, as it were, at our Egyptian neighbors and telling them, we reject your religion entirely. We are slaughtering your God. It was very important for us. We weren't trying to insult our Egyptian neighbors for no reason. It was very important for us to get up and say, you have your religion. We don't believe in your religion. We slaughter your idols. We don't believe in your religion. We have a truer religion. According to this third explanation, then, which is not found in any of the Rishonim, any of the medieval commentators, because they didn't know anything about ancient history and, and when they had leavened bread, when they didn't have leavened bread. But according to this third explanation, eating matzah that first Seder night was not commemorating the redemption. Redemption hadn't happened yet. eating matzah was parallel to Korban Pesach. It was a rejection, not of the Egyptian religion. It wasn't part of the religion to eat leavened bread. It was a rejection of the Egyptian society, of their advanced culture and technology. That was it. It was a technology. We think of technology as smartphones, but that was a technology of the times. We rejected the luxuries of the Egyptian lifestyle that they made available with their technologies. That's a big step. What we're saying is that in order to become Jewish, in order to assert our independence that first night, not only do we say to them, we don't want your Christmas tree because we don't believe in your religion, we also said to them, you know what? We don't need all the luxuries your society has to offer us. Maybe they're not all necessary. Okay, someday we'll come back to them. But you think we need everything your technology has to offer, everything your culture has to offer? We don't need any of it. We can manage just fine without it. We're not entranced by the baubles of your advanced civilization. Now, this is a very tricky point because as Jews, we try to take advantage of everything the world has to offer in order to advance our agenda of bringing the values of Hashem to this world, to bring the values of the Torah into this world. But on the other hand, there's a fine line between taking advantage of what the culture has to offer us and being addicted to, or being entrapped by, or being dependent on, or perhaps admiring a little too much those physical things, those technological advantages, those luxuries which society offers us. It's a very fine line. We take advantage. No one thinks that we should be hermits and move out to the desert, or the Amish, those people in America who try to live like the year 1800 and plow with oxen. But on the other hand, do we have to step back and think about whether everything that seems very important in the world out there, because everyone considers it important, really is so important? Or perhaps it's not important. Perhaps it's not worth the price. Perhaps it's not worth the assimilation that it brings with it. Perhaps it's not worth the disadvantages. Perhaps it's not a wise investment of our resources. That's a real challenge. That's a real challenge that I think speaks to us more than perhaps any generation of Jews Jews ever. Okay, look. Question, what about this? I have one of this, I need one of these. Step back and think, this is the chametz of the 21st century. Okay, I'm holding one of them. I find I'm tempted to throw this out, buy myself a flip phone, and not be available, 24 hours a day, 6 days a week for people to ask me halachic questions. But I don't give in to that temptation. But, do I bring this with me everywhere I go? Is it at the dinner table? Is it in my pocket when I go to shul? Is it, vibrating in my pocket when I'm supposed to be doing other things? I think all of these are good questions. What's my lifestyle? How luxurious should my lifestyle be? How much should I take advantage of everything the world is offering me? Okay, these are hard questions. I'm not here to give the answer to that questions, but I'm here to say that perhaps the struggle to finding the answer to that questions began 3,300 odd, however you calculate it, years ago, at the very night before, the very first Seder night before Yetziat Mitzrayim, when we told the Egyptians, not only don't we believe in your religion, but we don't need your fancy foods either. We will do just fine, thank you, with simple food. We'd rather have simple food and our own culture than have all the luxuries in the world and assimilate into your culture. Okay, hopefully you've given a lot of food for thought now. I know that I'm supposed to end now, but just to review, we started with a deceptively simple question. If matzah reminds us of our redemption, what did it mean the night before our redemption on that first Seder night when our ancestors ate it for the first time? And we gave 3 answers. Number 1, parallel to Morah, reminded us of our affliction. And the takeaway from that is, perhaps if we remember being poor, that changes the way we interact with and think about poor and disadvantaged and downtrodden people. Second answer, it didn't mean anything yet on that first Seder night. We ate matzah, we fulfilled the mitzvah, even though it didn't mean anything, because that's what Jews do. They have faith, not faith that will do something meaningless because it says so in the Torah. Faith that it is meaningful. We just haven't figured out the meaning yet. Just like our ancestors ate matzah on faith and figured out the meaning the next morning, and then it all came together very nicely and it all made sense. Likewise, to be a Jew, we have to do things on faith and hope that soon, and wait for the day when it will all come together nicely and make sense. And third, perhaps it was similar to the Korban Pesach, slaughtering not only the idols, but some of the culture of the Egyptians, because in order to have our own religion, in order to worship our God, in order to have an independent religion, we also need to think deeply about our relationship with everything else society has to offer, not reject it all, but at the very least declare our independence from it. At the very least, get to a place where we don't need it. We can live without it. It is not as important as everyone thinks it is, and then be able to think rationally and logically about what aspects that the technology and culture of our outside society has to offer are salutary and positive and can be used to further our goals and to improve our lives in all senses, and perhaps what aspects are going a little too far and are not necessary and are mere acculturation, bordering on assimilation, and need to be avoided. And I think all of these three hidden messages of the matzah are challenges for me, for you, for the Jew in the modern era, and give us a lot to think about as we sit down for our Pesach Seder. I want to thank once again Rabbi Silberman so much for organizing this shir. I want to thank everyone for learning with me. I hope that someday, maybe I'll be back maybe the world will be back to the world in person. Maybe I'll be able to have the zechut of coming back to Manchester in person, and then we can have much more of a conversation. And it is nice to see some of the familiar faces that I remember from my last trip to Manchester, BC, before COVID. And I'd like to wish everyone not only a Chag Kasher V'Sameach, a kosher and very joyous Pesach, but a liberating and enlightening Pesach, and one in which we can emerge from Pesach with just a little bit of a deeper appreciation and concretization of our freedom than we went into Pesach with. And I hopefully we'll be able to learn together again soon. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Bednarsh. Very enlightening cheer, also very well organized and put together. We do have one question, at least, already. If anyone else wants to have a question, put up your hand in the window and I'll call on you. We're very lucky to be sponsoring this year together with Steen Court, which Rabbi Bednarsh knows quite well. And our first question is from Rabbi Simmons from Steen Court. So Rabbi Simmons, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much, Shkoch, for the very, very nice share. I just want to ask you on one point. In the third exposition, I can understand the idea that we don't want to buy in too much to the Egyptian society, but I can't understand the idea that the Egyptians invented bread. It says in Parashas, first of all, with Melchizedek Melech Shalem, it says he brought Hotzi Lechem Vayayin, and then secondly with Avram Avinu, it says when the Malachim came, Va'echol Pas Lechem. And he can't be referring to matzah because when it was a story of light, it says matzah is offer via chelim. So therefore, bread must have been in existence beforehand. It couldn't have come from Egypt. The Torah says it.
Okay, that is a very good question. I mean, that strikes at the heart of what the word lechem means in the Torah. Right, you have a strong diuk, which you're bringing, which is that since lot baked matzot, therefore every other lechem in the Torah must be leavened bread, must be chametz. In which case, Avram Avinu had chametz, and so did Melchizedek. I'm going to question that assumption. Many use of the word lechem in the Torah actually refer to matzah. Like, for example, the lechem hapanim, which is I think in English you call it the showbread, that we put on the shulchan in the Mishkan and later the Beit HaMikdash every Shabbat, was matzah. The Gemara says in Menachos. Even what we call challah, right? We talk about challah a lot, but challah in Chumash is chalot matzot lulot bashemen that we just had in last week's parsha, and we're gonna have something similar in this coming week's parsha. So it could be that it's an interesting question. Now you're challenging me. So why by Lot does it say matzot afa, and by Avraham and Melchizedek it doesn't say matzot? But lechem can mean matzah. Lechem doesn't necessarily mean chametz. Lechem can mean matzah in the Torah. So that's a question we have to figure out, why it says matzah in some places, lechem other places. But I would claim that Avram served matzah to the three malachim, and that Melchizedek served matzah to Avram Avinu. That's what I'd be bold enough to claim. Although I still have an outstanding question, which I don't have the answer to now. I have to think about.
I'll say something to that. It doesn't take away from your very nice idea, because it could still be that it was a luxury food which the Egyptians had, and we didn't want to accept it. We wanted to reject it, even if they didn't invent it. My point was just the fact that they'd invented it. It doesn't take away your idea, which is a very nice idea.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rabbi Simmons. And now, Paul, I believe your hand's up. You can ask away.
Hi, Rabbi Bednarsh. Thank you so much for a great share. Lovely to see you again. We've missed you at Steam Court. But a quick question on Pshat of the Ramban. The function of the mitzvah for the matzah, as being a lechem only, is saying that was what they ate anyway. So I suppose it's a bit of a practical question. Would they have been sitting down to eat matzah anyway that night, or at that point were they not slaves enough to eat matzah? In other words, was it a change for them, or I mean, what's the big deal? Eat matzah. I was going to do it anyway because that's the bread that I eat. Where's the mitzvah? Where's the hishtadlus there?
That's a great question. Good to see you as well, Paul, by the way. That is a great question. The answer is I can't answer for certain. I can't answer with certainty. But I might surmise that at that point they were free enough that they could have had the choice not to eat matzah. And perhaps, as you can imagine, if you're a slave they weren't freed yet, but they weren't working anymore. There had already been 9 makot against the Mitzrim. They clearly have the upper hand at that point. So I might surmise that they might have been tempted, or they might have thought that a celebratory meal should involve chametz at that point, and therefore they had to be commanded to eat matzah. So I can't prove it, but that's what I would surmise.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Once again, thank you very much to everyone for joining us for this Mizrahi and Steenkot Prepesach Shir. Thank you very much, Rabbi Bednarsh, for joining from Eretz Yisrael. It's very, very enlightening. And we wish everyone a Chag Kasher v'Sameach. And we look forward from Mizrahi to sharing many things in person, hopefully, as we move towards the end of Corona, and look out for our other upcoming events. Thank you very much, and good evening.
Thank you so much, Ray Silverman.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again.
My pleasure.